been so many things that I've been trying to take notes of. Some of the little things I wrote down. The one was this morning, don't make God small. Don't make God small. If they don't grow with you, they can't go with you. If they don't go with you, they can't grow with you. Guard your heart. The difference between pastoring and preaching and finding the right dynamic. This great power is not from us. This great power is not from us. We need to daily unplug from the world and plug into God. Be a key in His hand and stop trying to be the engine. And certainly, one of my favorites, if you've had too many QBs, that's a problem. It's a problem. Well, really great to be with you. Who's having a great time so far? It's been amazing. Well, my name is Paul, and I love coffee. It's not a problem. I love coffee. I love coffee for so many different reasons. One of the reasons why I love coffee is because you can have a bad cup of coffee and a good cup of coffee. And what determines whether or not you have a bad cup of coffee or a good cup of coffee is the amount of love that goes into the preparation. And that's true right from the time that you actually plant the seed. Where do you plant it? What does it look like? What's the quality of the seed? There's two main varieties of coffee that we have in our world, and the one is Robusta and the other one is Arabica. Robusta, its name tells us it's a robust plant. You can plant it almost anywhere. It grows like a weed. Get a lot of it from Brazil. And it's got an acidic taste. Most of our cheaper coffee is Robusta coffee. But then you get Arabica. Arabica is a bit of a finicky plant. It has to grow at high altitudes, preferably above 1,000 meters. It can't have frost. If it has frost, it's going to die. Hojas and bugs and stuff, they like to eat it. Can't have direct sunlight. And all these things actually add to whether or not you actually get something amazing out of the bean or not. Then it goes into the type of soil that is planted in. Does it have enough nutrients in it? The love that is taken when you pick the bean. Because you can machine pick the beans, but then you're just going to get this random selection and the coffee isn't going to be great. But if you hand pick the bean at the right time, when it's perfectly ripe, because all the beans they don't all ripen at the same time. So you got to put a lot of love just into how you pick the bean. And then how do you actually get the bean out of the fruit is another big deal. Like that's actually takes love and it takes attention. And then you take that and you dry it, go into the drying process. And then you go into the roasting process. How do you roast it? At what speed, what time do you take to roast it? How long do you roast it for? What's the temperature? And then even the cooling process, and that's just to get the beans. And then how long do they stay on the shelf for? What sort of pressure do you put it under to extract it from the bean? When you grind it, even the amount of atmosphere, the amount of moisture in the atmosphere determines what that bean is going to taste like. Then go into frothing the milk, because, good coffee is best with milk. Cappuccinos is amazing. So it goes into frothing the milk. Like, it can't be too cold, can't be too hot. Box milk. So I didn't know, Pastor Donovan and I, we like good milk. But even the frothing process of the milk can't be too cold, can't be too hot, definitely not above 70 degrees, you're going to destroy it. Like if you've got overheated milk, it doesn't matter how good your bean is, you're going to destroy a good cappuccino. Now, I tell you all of this, not because I'm fanatical about coffee, but because there's something behind the coffee. Because coffee does something. A good cup of coffee does something. It's done something for me. See, 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, my wife and I were newly married, and God called us to leave our beautiful house in Bloemfontein and to go and move up to rural western Zambia. See, God had called us to go and plant life-giving churches amongst communities in western Zambia that didn't have access to the gospel. And so we packed up our things. We managed to get a second-hand 4x4 and a tent and a little boat, and we drove up and we found ourselves in Mongu, the capital of western Zambia. And we set it up as a base, and we had this dream in our heart that God wanted us to plant churches and to reach western Zambia with the gospel. And so this is exactly what we started to do. We was actually leave Mongu, then go and drive 5 or 6 hours to a community village and then share the gospel, gather the people together under a tree and start forming a church. And then we'd drive another 5 or 6 hours to the next community, do the same, and drive another 5 or 6 hours to the next community with the idea that if we thought that if we planted these churches every 5 or 6 hours and they became healthy, eventually they would grow towards each other and we'd actually saturate the whole area with the gospel. And so that's what we started to do, and we gave everything that we had towards it. We sacrificed everything. And you must feel sorry for my wife because I'm a bit of a minimalist when it comes to camping. Like a chair is a luxury option that you don't really need to take it with. You could weigh down the car, it makes you drive slowly through the bush. And so we gave everything we had. We worked really, really hard. And by the end of the first year, we were able to start 7 churches. And we're over the moon. Like real life was starting to take place. And then into our second year, started to do it again, and eventually that loop would take us 2 to 3 weeks to complete the loop as we started to plant more and more churches. By the end of the second year, we had 14 churches. But then Marinette was pregnant with our firstborn son, Seth, and so she started to stay behind in Mongu a little bit more often, and I would go out, and she would then look after the work that was taking place in Mongu, spend time with some of the local people, leaders in Mongu, and also just help try and fundraise because we had very little money, send newsletters out, communicate with volunteer teams, and then I would go. But we only had one 4x4, and we didn't have satellite phone or cell phones. There was no cell phone connection, so I would leave my amazing wife in Mongu without a phone, without internet, and I would go into the bush and hopefully remember to say goodbye and give her a kiss on my way when I left, and we'd see each other in 2 to 3 weeks. And then I'd go and do this and give everything. And absolute exhaustion. I can remember there's sometimes that in that second year, just feeling so tired. I drive sometimes like an 18, 19-hour day, just feeling so tired. I'd fall down in my tent that night. And then get up early the next morning and just go again, and just go again, and go again, and go again, and go again. And eventually I started to realize, I started to think to myself, if it was up to sheer grit and determination, if it was just up to absolute we will get the job done. But unfortunately, we know that the planting of life-giving churches isn't just up to sheer grit and determination. And it was around about that point in time that I came across this story of a man that it challenged me. This is a guy by the name sorry, I've lost my place. There we go. A guy by the name of Robert Murray Mchini. He was a 19th century preacher. And after graduating, I get this, he graduated university when he was 14 years old. In 1827, and he started leading a Presbyterian congregation that somehow by God's grace grew to over 1,000 people by the age he was 23. But he worked so hard that his health finally broke and his body gave in. And before dying at the age of 29, he said this. He said, God gave me a message to deliver and a horse to ride. Alas, I've killed the horse and now cannot deliver the message. Alas, I've killed the horse and now I cannot deliver the message. The reality is in our church planting, we want to see churches planted, and through sheer determination, we can kill the horse. And I'm not just talking about our physical bodies. I'm talking about sometimes our marriages, our relationship with our kids, our own spiritual walk with God. We can backslide in the process. We can stop spending time with God because we're so determined on trying to get the job done. God gave me a message to deliver and a horse to ride. Alas, I've killed the horse and now cannot deliver the message. It's because the planting of the church, planting of churches and growing life-giving churches, is that the Bible describes us as co-laborers. We work with God. And so God does bless hard work. Please don't get me wrong. God doesn't bless laziness. Like you got to work hard. Like you have to work hard. But hard work alone isn't going to get the job done. Like we got to also make sure that we're connected with him and we realize once again that we are the key, he's the engine. But we still we have a responsibility to work hard to give God our best because God does bless hard work. But in our partnering, in the divine partnership, which is what we're about. It's this divine human partnership in the establishment of growing and seeing people's lives transformed. And this divine relationship that we have with God is that unfortunately, we often overestimate what we can do in the short term, but we underestimate what we can do over the long term. And there's this passage where God introduces himself, and he actually introduces himself like this many times, and I'm sure you might be familiar with it. It's the book of Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, it says, is where God speaks to Moses, the burning bush, and speaks to him through the burning bush, and he says, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Isn't it interesting about how God introduces himself? He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if we want to co-labor with God, we need to understand the way that God works. And one of the ways that God works is that God works generationally. He works generationally. And so when I thought about that, I thought, well, I'm trying to do this because Marinette and I know, ignorance of youth, we thought that we'd only have to be in Zambia for 2 years. I don't know how we thought that. But the longer that we're there, the more we realized that we had completely overestimated what it would actually take to reach Western Zambia for God. We completely overestimated it. So we thought to take a step back and say, oh, we have to change our strategy. And so we actually had to slow down. We had to take a step back. The other thing that I read that also just reminded me again, and this is in John chapter 1, verse 14, where it says, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So if we want to work with God, we need to realize that God works generationally. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As a matter of fact, we know the story, if we actually go back even before that, the dream to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and actually go to the land of Canaan actually started with Abraham's father. So there was something generational in the call to go to Canaan, to be established in Canaan, that actually started with Abraham's father, and even was in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and even them, none of them actually saw the fulfillment of it, but there was this promise about something more, and they all worked towards it. And that's often the way that God works with us, and the way that God builds life-giving churches. I've got to change the way that I think, and I've got to start thinking long-term. I've got to change the way that I build, and I've got to start building long-term. And I need to think generationally about the way that I do things. The other thing is that we need to realize is that God made his dwelling amongst us. It doesn't say that God came to work amongst us, which he did. It doesn't mean that God came to preach amongst us, which he did. It doesn't mean that God came to heal, which he did. It says that God came to dwell amongst us. So often I think in our ministry models, we can get so busy that we stop dwelling. We stop dwelling. We get so busy on tasks, and especially if you're a leader, which you probably are if you're in this room, is that you're task-orientated. We have a bias towards action. We have a bias towards work. And so we get so busy working that we stop dwelling, and our ministry is less and less incarnational. But God was incarnational. God is incarnational in the way that he does things, in the way that he works. He's generational and he's incarnational. And so that forced us to stop. So we realized that we needed to make some changes. When we first moved up to Zambia, the first 2 years, we never had water at our house. We didn't have TV. We didn't have much. But I thought, actually, I've got a new baby on the way. I actually need to take more responsibility. God, forgive me for maybe neglecting my responsibilities as a husband, as a father. and we got water at our home. Is that good? Hey, we got running water. Had a flushing toilet. Thank you, Jesus, for flushing toilets. Hot shower. That's a big difference. So we actually did that, and that made a big difference. But then also one of the things that we did is we started to change the way that we were doing work. I started to change the way that, and how, even when I went out into the bush, into these rural communities, I started to be very intentional about who I was taking with me, because I needed to start thinking generationally. So I started to choose the people that would go with me very intentionally. And not only did I intentionally take certain people with me when I went on these trips, I wanted to stop more. I wanted to dwell more. So I thought, how can I force myself to do this? I'm going to force myself to stop for coffee every 3 to 4 hours. But not just any coffee. I'm going to have a good cup of coffee. So I'd pack a coffee box in the back of the car. And every 3 to 4 hours, would stop the car, get a table. I actually brought a table with me. Get chairs. Actually have chairs, put out the chairs. Actually have coffee beans, grind the coffee beans. Have a proper bialetti, and actually had a really good shot of coffee. It was before the days of AeroPress. I'd actually take milk out, proper milk, and actually warm it up by hand and then froth it by hand and have the most amazing cappuccino in the bush. Like that little bit of excellence changed everything. Like the world could be falling around, but I'm like, this is awesome. This is awesome. It changed everything. It refreshed me. I could work harder for longer because I had a good cup of coffee. Like a little bit of excellence can do that. A little bit of luxury can change. It just refreshes your soul. Can I say that in church? A little bit of luxury can refresh your soul. Can I get an amen? But you know what we found happened was something quite amazing started to happen was the people that would be coming with me in the bush, when we stopped and had coffee, we started to talk. When we're going through the coffee, instead of rushing here and there, because we forced ourselves to stop and have coffee, we started to have conversations about life, about theology, about what we just experienced in the village before this. But what about the challenge that we're having, about the village that we're going to, what we were trusting God to in the next village. We spent more time praying. Started talking about our families, about our dreams for our future. And I look back on that and that generational, that burden that was inside of me and inside of Marinette and I started to be passed on to those guys I was having coffee with on the side of the road. And most of them are here today. Moses, leading Hope Church in Mongo, a phenomenal church. Morris Mahali, we had lots of coffee on the side of the road. He is a phenomenal theologian. I mean, he's just, the way he articulates difficult things in theology is just, but we had lots of conversations, having coffee on the side of the road. Matt, just an amazing, amazing human being. His love for God, his passion, his intimacy with God. He's a phenomenal husband and father. We had lots of coffee together. Brad oversees 160 churches now. Over 10,000 people on a Sunday. But we had lots of coffee together. Brad then started having lots of coffee with Jonathan. Jonathan now oversees 70 churches. He's a church planting machine. I mean, the miracles that are taking place. There's this multiplication effect because we started to pause and have coffee. By the way, all of them love coffee. I'll just throw that out there. Like they really love coffee. So it's actually become compulsory in our church planting approach in Zambia that every single 4x4 has to have a coffee box. And you have to stop for coffee. But it's not about the coffee. It's not about the coffee. On some of these trips that we were going out, I started to talk and just find out a little bit more about some of the people that we were going out with. And one of them was Anton Pelakeli. He's also over there, Anton. He started to share with me his story I didn't know this. I'd known him for a year or two. I didn't know this until we started to drive together and stop and have lots of coffee together. I didn't know that at the age of 14, 13 years old, he was living in Angola and taken as a child soldier. Tried to escape numerous times, couldn't escape. Eventually, he just became a soldier. But when he was 28, there was an unease about him, and he ran away. Ran into Zambia, threw his AK-47 in the river as he ran into Zambia, and prayed for the first time and said, God, now my life is in your hands. Started to spend time with him, and I've learned so much from them. Hopefully they've learned more than just the love for coffee from me, but I've learned so much from them. One time, Anton and I were driving from Mongu to Lukulu, which is north of Mongu, and then we're going to go to a place called Mateti. We're trying to open up that area to the gospel. And it was in September, and it's across this floodplain section. And as we're driving, we're going to this one particular area called Luwena Flats. It's quite wet. And it was in September, the floodplain hadn't quite dried up yet. Driving in a big Land Cruiser, and we're driving, and what you got to do when you're driving through these floodplain sections, you go into this bit of water, check it out, it's fine. So we get out, test it, you walk, is it firm, is it okay, yeah, it's all fine. Get back in the car, go to another piece of water, is it fine, get out, test it, is the ground firm enough, no, it's fine, get back in the 4x4, drive through the water again, do it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. By the 7th time, the sun's coming down, there's a piece of water we see, it's going around the corner like that, I'm sure it's fine. Anton's like, no, Paul, let's just check. No, it's fine, no, we're late, let's just go. We just sunk into this deep, stinking mud. Opened the car doors, water rushed in. Bright Spark Paul forgot to bring the spade or the high lift jack. So we tried to get the car. We can't. Trying to do what we can, dig, got a little bottle jack, put our head torches on. Now the sun's gone down, and Anton says, Paul, there's something on your leg. I lift up my leg, and there's this leech on my leg. So I watched too many movies. I'm trying to find a light or something to burn it off. He's like, he's a child soldier. He's like, Paul, that's not how you get a leech off. Just hit it really hard. So I'm like, okay. And so I hit it really hard, and I grab it, and I throw it in the water. He says, why do you do that? So I said, I don't know. He says, no, he'll swim back. And you're bleeding now, so all his friends are going to come. So the next minute I look up, and you can see them swimming towards my leg. They can sense the blood. I lift up this leg, like 5 or 10 leeches. This leg, lots of leeches. Then we under the water, leeches on my head. I'm not happy. I'd like to tell you that I cried, but I didn't. I almost did, but I didn't cry. And so this carried on in frustration, and eventually we gave, okay, this 4x4 is not coming out. We heard a village that was quite close by. We kept on trying to call them to come and help us, and they wouldn't come, and that was a bit frustrating. So Anton sleeps in the car. I find a little piece of dry land. I put my tent up, and I go to sleep. And wake up the next morning, and the villagers come to us, and I'm like, hey, why didn't you come and help us last night? And they're like, hey, didn't you hear the dogs barking? Yeah, no, there were 2 lions walking around. That's why we didn't come and help you. Like, okay. So now we're stuck. So we call them, hey, maybe you got some oxen. You can get some oxen, you can pull us out. So they don't know they're going to do that. So they get 12 oxen. 12 oxen, chains. They try to pull the Land Cruiser out. This Land Cruiser is going nowhere. Now, we're on the floodplain, so there's no trees. And normally, if you get cars stuck, you're trying to you try and find some like logs or something like that to put wedge underneath the car to try and get out. We're stuck. So I'm like, Anton, I don't know what we're going to do. We've got to get to Mateti. I don't know what we're going to do. Anton's like, we're going to build a bridge. So with what, Anton? Like, I'm at that point of frustration. I hadn't had coffee. I'm like, in situations like that, Anton is way more spiritual than me. Like, with what? Like what? What are you gonna do? With what? So he walks up, and there's just these little bushes everywhere. And he gets a little stick. He says, then we're going to build a bridge with this. So I'm like, it's a stick. You're going to build a bridge with a stick, Anton? And I remember actually in my frustration taking the stick and breaking it in front of them. Look, you can't build a bridge with a stick. So he went and got some more sticks, and he hold them together. He says, we're going to get lots of them and try and break it. And he couldn't break it. He says, if we get enough sticks, we're going to build a bridge. And so the next 5-6 hours, we just got lots of sticks. and we built a bridge, and we drove the Land Cruiser out of there. And I realized that with enough small sticks, anything is possible. And I remember praying about that, and I felt like that's how so often the church is like. We get stuck and we get bogged down by situations, we get frustrated, we can feel hopeless. But there's lots of small sticks. We just got to open our eyes to realize it. So often we're looking for the big logs, the big gifts. If I just had a youth pastor, if I just had a this, if I just had a that. If I only had this, if I only had a screen like this, then. Amen, amen. Yeah, if I just. But the reality is that God's given you more than enough little sticks. You just need to put the sticks together. So build bridges with lots of small sticks. I want to encourage you to, in your thinking, in your planning, it doesn't have to be coffee, but do something. In your thinking and your planning, in the way that you do life, in the way that you building church, to think generationally and act incarnationally. Like, you've got to do life together. Now, you can't do life with everybody. And we know that Jesus came and dwelt with us, but he didn't do life with everybody, but he did do life with a few people. And those few people were chosen people that he chose to be incarnational with, that he chose to dwell with, that he chose to do life with, and the conversations that they had. I love reading the Gospels because I realize that we read things and we take things for granted. Like, for example, how do we know about Jesus' temptation? How do we know? He never taught about his temptation, his time in the wilderness in a sermon. It must have been around a campfire while they're frying some fish, when he had a conversation with them, and they maybe might have asked him, well, how do you overcome temptation? He says, well, let me tell you what happened to me. Remember that time that I disappeared for 40 days? Yeah. I was in the desert. I never ate. I was hungry. The devil came and told me this. We know about Jesus' temptation because he must have told them while he was dwelling with them. And we have to somehow think generationally, and the best way for us to do that is to act incarnationally, and the best way for us to do that is to make sure that we actually dwell. That it's not just task, we've got to do life with people. And I look back at the work in Zambia and everything that's happening, and it is absolutely amazing. And we are on track to have 2,300 churches by 2038. We're on track. That's a pretty scary number. But we're actually on track. It's actually amazing. Now, if you'd asked me 5, 10, 20 years ago, I'm like, it's impossible. But now we're starting to see the work unfold. We're actually moving forward. We're actually on track. As a matter of fact, we had this 20-year plan. We're ahead of schedule by 4 years. So we might actually get the job done sooner than that. Think generationally, act incarnationally. A little bit of luxury can rejuvenate us. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that spoiling yourself and your wife and having a really good cup of coffee is a waste. Like, we need to be frugal, absolutely. We need to be good with our money, absolutely. But let's make sure that we have a little bit of luxury, because it actually is amazing. Like, a flushing toilet is a big deal. Like, hot water when you shower can be a game changer. You can go for another week if you had a hot shower and a flushing toilet and a really good cup of coffee and a great steak. A great steak. You see, I bought a fridge. I bought one of those fridges that plugs into your car. And so instead of eating beans, I started to freeze fillet steak and put it in the freezer, and every night eat fillet steak. Well, that was a game changer. I just found that my preaching was so much better. I was just so much kinder. Instead of trying to rip people's heads off, I was actually kind. I could listen. I could be patient. Like, you got to think about these things. So a little bit of luxury can rejuvenate us. With enough small sticks, you can build amazing bridges. You can get real momentum. If you're feeling stuck, start gathering small sticks. If you're feeling like you're not going anywhere, just start gathering small sticks and watch what God will do. Stop regularly for coffee. Just stop. Just pause somewhere in the day. Like, set your alarm clock. Just pause. Just go do something just to stop regularly for coffee. Like, it's not a waste of time. You heard Pastor Jacob said, you've got to sharpen your axe. Just stop and sharpen your axe, because the axe becomes dull because you're working it so hard. We just want to work harder and harder. No, stop. Have a cup of coffee. And while you're having a cup of coffee, sharpen your axe. And life is actually easier. So put those things into the rhythms of your life, into the rhythms of your ministry. And the last one, and I think this is one that I'm pretty sure most of us, if not all of us in the room, fall into this trap. COVID happened. And we've been working hard, and God's been doing incredible things. But because of COVID, we had a conversation with Brad and Jonathan and some of the other guys on the team. We had a conversation. We were a bit concerned because many of these villages that we work with, that we plant churches with in rural Zambia, they're quite isolated. And we thought, well, if one of our team has COVID, we could actually take COVID into these villages, and we don't want to be responsible for taking. So this is in the early days of COVID. We're a bit nervous about being they don't have medical care. There's no oxygen out there. Well, there's lots of oxygen but you know what I mean. There's no So we didn't want to be responsible for taking COVID into these villages. So what do we do? So we thought about it. We thought, well, instead of us going out, let's rather spend the amount of time praying. And we've always prayed, and we've always worked hard, and we've always tried to use strategy. But I think something quite amazing happened, because we'd been busy working really hard, gathering wood. But somehow, just in the last 2 years, we have been more intentional about praying. We've been praying a lot more. And somehow God has breathed on the work, even more than what it was previously. Somehow, we've considerably more than doubled in 2 years. 18 years of hard work, in 2 years, we've always worked hard. We've always built team. And I think, yes, all those other things were adding to our momentum. But prayer, for most of us, we're action-orientated. So we work hard. We get up early. We work hard. But let's spend a little bit more time praying. A little bit more time praying for our leaders. A little bit more time, instead of having a conversation with them, pray. Soak what we're doing in prayer. Soak our leaders in prayer. Soak our ministries in prayer. Just soak in prayer. And I do believe that if we do that, we'll see a whole lot more reward. Because ultimately we are co-laboring with God. We work with Him to see His kingdom advance. So I'm going to ask you, would you stand with me to your feet? You know, all of us have been praying and we trust in God that during this time that something special is going to happen in our lives and in our hearts. And obviously there's information, there's impartation, there's connections, there's relationships. But we want to make sure that what we're hearing settles into us. So like, it must change us. Like, it must move us. We must act differently, not just hearing information, but Lord, how do I do this differently? How do I make sure that in my daily rhythms, I've actually got healthy rhythms? That I'm stopping regularly, that I'm having a little bit of luxury, that I'm having coffee, that I'm not just thinking generationally, but I'm actually acting incarnationally. Help me to value small sticks. Help me to do that well, Lord. Help me to pray more and trust you more, Jesus. Because if we do these and everything else that we've heard, if we do these, if these things actually change us, like they change the way that we see ourselves, they change the way that we see our work, then God comes in. Because ultimately it's His work, hey? It really is. So I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask you to pray as well. Just spend some time, just